Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present Chayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
On Chayim, I have a wonderful pleasure now of sitting with Steve Obsitnik, who is the Republican candidate running in the 4th District of Connecticut for the United States Congress. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you.
You went to Annapolis, and you had a distinguished career, I believe, for many years on a nuclear submarine.
That's correct.
Okay. So you're a kid growing up in Connecticut. What makes you want to go to Annapolis and join the Navy? At that point, you're going to be there for a number of years, but something draws you to military service. Steve, what is it?
I think there's something inside, I don't know if it's my family DNA or inside of me, that I'm drawn to serve in some ways. And my father graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1959. He was an immigrant from Czechoslovakia himself. And he instilled in me that, there is something bigger than yourself that you have to invest in. My uncle,
what was your father's name?
Vince Obsitnik.
Vince.
Yeah.
He comes from Czechoslovakia.
1938 he left.
1938, which is, by the way, just as World War II is
9 months before Hitler went through.
Wow.
And he returned in 2006 as the U.S. ambassador to the Slovak Republic.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
How did he become a United States ambassador?
He worked hard, in the helping George Bush get elected. And it's a much longer story for this show. But,
right.
But he was born in a mud hut in Czechoslovakia and returned as the U.S. ambassador.
It must have also been very dramatic for him when the Iron Curtain came down.
Absolutely.
Did he ever talk to you about it? Can you tell me what it meant for your family as a whole? Czechoslovakia being part of the former Soviet Union, and now here comes the Iron Curtain comes down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what it really showed is that, especially religion was very repressed over there, and I have relatives that were priests over there and had to worship underground and so forth. I mean, there was a lifting, of spirit and emotion when the repressive regime went away, and I think that's what's important. Not that we are anywhere close to that, but I think, this big election is about the role of government, right? And I've seen when government has played a very heavy hand, and I've seen where government has played, I think, the right amount of hand in terms of my father coming here as an immigrant, my grandfather being a coal miner in western Pennsylvania, to my father being educated, and then the path that they've been able to set me up through education and hard work and all those values which are so important to us as Americans.
Okay, you joined the Navy. You go to Annapolis. You do very, very well at Annapolis.
Could have done better, but yes.
And then now you're commissioned to serve on a submarine, correct?
Yes.
A nuclear submarine.
Yes.
In what capacity, Steve?
I was as an officer, you're kind of a generalist, and you drive the submarine around and everything. But my specialty was in the nuclear power plant, so I was one of the head nuclear engineers.
Okay. Just give me I want to have a sense of the emotional experience of what it's like to be on a nuclear sub.
I mean, nuclear power from an energy source it's awesome, and it's incredibly volatile, right? And it does afford us one of the because now President Obama does classify it as a green energy source. It provides one of the best green energy sources we have, and one of the cleanest while you're burning. But then you obviously have the waste left over, and that's a problem which we have to deal with. But when you look at what a submarine has to do to go under the polar ice cap and leave for 180 days and not refuel itself, it just gives us tremendous ability to project, U.S. power and go places where submarines and machines have never gone. I think when handled correctly with the right controls, if you take away terrorist threats for a second and security threats, nuclear power can be managed appropriately. I think where we really have to evolve to, where China is beating us right now, they're evolving nuclear technology to the point where they're using things like thorium-based reactors, which prevent a Japanese meltdown problem. And if we believe that nuclear has to be an important part of our overall energy strategy, we need to innovate our technologies over where we are today, because we are living with security risks in our nuclear power plants and things that can be avoided if we innovate our technology. And the technology is out there to just do that. If we believe nuclear has to be a part, and I do,
you do,
if done safely, yes, absolutely. I think we have to have a interweaving of nuclear, alternative, natural gas, you name it, because we're going to see prices move around, and we have to have an overall energy strategy which addresses all these touch points.
And if the government wanted to establish a nuclear facility, a nuclear plant in Fairfield County, Connecticut. Would you be against it?
I think Fairfield County might be a little too close just in terms of population and proximity to New York. But I think there are you know, I hate the, you know, not in my backyard approach.
Right.
But I think that, you know, we can find geographic solutions which get power here, which preserves from a threat and security standpoint. You know, that would be advantageous to bring down our cost of energy. I mean, look, we know we're ranked 50th in a lot in the United States. Unfortunately, the state of Connecticut, and we are ranked 50th in gas prices in terms of the costliness of it and electricity. And the reason why is Connecticut is the end of the value chain. It's the end of the train for everything. Everything ends here. It doesn't begin here. So yeah, I think we really need to challenge ourselves. If we want enterprise here, we want manufacturing here, we've got to address the cost of energy. And obviously transportation and everything else, but cost of energy is so key. Without that, we can't sit here and say we want manufacturers here if we can't address that need, cost-effective energy.
So here we are sitting on Shalom TV, and obviously the perspective we are most concerned with are issues that relate to the Jewish community of the State of Israel. Mm-hmm. But have you ever been to Israel?
I have, when I was in the Navy. I served, when I was in the Navy, our submarine did coordinate operations with the Turkish Navy, the Israeli Navy. I've been in Haifa, places like that. You know, I like to say with Israel, my relationship with Israel is kind of a gentle sunrise. Because when I moved here from Virginia in end of sixth grade, Mark, I can't tell you if I knew a Jewish person in my life, mm-hmm. to be honest. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden I come to Stamford, Connecticut. I go to Turner River Middle School. And I'm surrounded by friends now who are Jewish. And it took me a little bit to understand culturally what the importance was. And, you know, we share a relationship with the Sammers, and Bertie and Edith Sammers. And I remember sitting at their kitchen table, walking in, and the two of them debating over Israel. I'm like, wait, this is a marriage? Like, and I got, you know, at a Shabbat dinner, I got into, okay, these are issues of our time which I was never exposed to. So my relationship was first seeded, I think, with them, and then expanded when I was in the Navy, serving with the IDF. And then economically, in business, I've done a lot of work with Israeli companies. Unfortunately, I've proven not to be a very good negotiator with Israeli companies. I'm a firm believer in the startup nation and what Israel's disproportionate contribution to the world, given the size. And yeah, I have such high respect for organizations like Weitzman and Technion. And probably the largest impact that Judaism has had, you know, which kind of brought the full sun over the horizon, was when I went to Wharton, and I sat down the first day next to a beautiful girl from Westport, and turns out she was Jewish. And a Catholic person who was an altar boy, whose father was a deacon, my world, to be honest, was flipped upside down, because I was programmed, as many people are, marry within your religion. And but I found the right woman for me, and she was Jewish, and we've had a wonderful marriage of 15 years. We have 2 daughters, Kaden and Kira. We do attend, you know, Catholic services, and we also attend services at Temple Shalom in Norwalk with Rabbi Lipson.
This is Suzanne.
This is Suzanne. And my father-in-law was raised Orthodox. Yeah, so I have high regard in terms of the many facets of Judaism in Israel, which, so when we get to the topic of Israel, it really isn't political for me, it's more personal. Mm-hmm. And sometimes admittedly, I have to step back from my personal connections to also make sure that, you know, hopefully as a congressman, that we are making the right decisions for America. But I do believe that America and Israel are intertwined, and what's in our national interest is their national interest.
So talk to me about your feelings about Iran, mm-hmm. and the nuclear threat. First, in general, mm-hmm. how much are you concerned with the consequences of an Iran developing a nuclear weapon? And the reason I ask that is, there are those who say it would be of disastrous consequence, mm-hmm. and there are those who say we don't want proliferation in general, we wish no other country would get it, but the reality is that nobody uses a nuclear weapon, and for all the bluster, while it would definitely create some instability in the Middle East, the notion of Iran literally using a nuclear weapon is remote, even as crazy as their ideology is. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there are those who are saying, I mean, we saw in the Republican primaries where there was one candidate, right. Ron Paul, who was saying, he was not saying they should be allowed to get the bomb, but he was saying
Right.
if it happened, he understood why they wanted it,
Right.
and maybe it wouldn't be as bad as people are saying.
Right.
From your perspective, how would you explain to people who are going to have to go to the polls and perhaps vote for you or not vote for you, where do you stand on this issue?
Being a Navy veteran and being in combat environments, when you are going up against forces that have nuclear weapons versus don't, it's very different in terms of your calculus of the strength of a foe, right? And let's get to Iran in a second. Let's look at North Korea. Let's look at Pakistan. And let's look at how they're able to manipulate the flow of funds or subsidies just by holding out, I have a nuclear weapon, okay? And so I think proliferation is a bad thing, because I think then it allows someone, A, to have a negotiating chip, which they shouldn't be negotiating on that behalf to begin with, first of all. Second of all, people may use it. I mean, it doesn't rule out, just because no one has used it, doesn't mean that they won't use it. And I think the biggest reason may not be a nation state using it, but the fear in Pakistan where a group of rogue terrorists get access to it. Or you have people who supply technology like the North Koreans do, are providing nuclear technology to other people like Iran to help facilitate it. So I think it just creates a web of relationships that are not stable in the world that we're in, and it leads to an environment when you zero in on Iran to where you don't know what that leadership will do, to achieve their ultimate aim, which has been the annihilation of Israel. And for 6 decades, you've had countries on every side of Israel whose sole focus has been to eradicate Jews and the state of Israel. And Israel has never asked for anything from America except for, never asked for human life, never asked us to jump in any war. They've asked for machinery and they've asked for money and paid back a lot of the money. So here's a country that has never asked for American life, who shares our democratic principles, our free enterprise principles. I side with that country. And when I see a nuclear-armed Iran across the border, we have to do everything in our power in working with Israel to ensure that just does not happen.
Would it be a disaster if Iran gets a nuclear weapon?
I would say yes.
Okay.
I would say yes.
The way the problem is right now presented to the public is over this red line. Should Israel, should the United States, should the West, should the United Nations, should there be some public red line? And again, you bring an interesting dynamic because of your naval background. I have heard people argue effectively for both yes and no, that a red line would be extremely important and a red line would in fact make the problem more complicated at the moment. Steve, where do you stand? Should there or should there not be a red line?
We have a country that is focused on creating a nuclear weapon, and many of them. That's their stated goal. That's their intention. So the question is, how do you avoid that from happening? I do agree, you first use every diplomatic route you have, you use every economic channel. Sanctions arguably are starting to work. We're seeing massive fluctuations in prices over there. And just recently, the Congress just passed or gave the president more latitude in increasing sanctions on them. I still don't think the sanctions are being held hard enough. When you look at the top 20 oil trading partners with Iran, are still trading at almost full volume. Okay, I think that's where we have to go next, is to tighten that down. So I'd want to do everything possible to avoid putting any boots on the ground in a place like Iran. But given its importance here, we have to work with Israel and with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to ensure that we're aligned with our greatest ally. And when I'm running against a congressman who, on the one hand, signed that Gaza 54 letter because he was influenced by whatever force that said, it's more important, the security of Israel, to have aid to Gaza. Okay, I think we need to keep Israel very close. And my position has been, where has his outrage been on Mohammed Morsi saying we need to revisit the Camp David Accords? Or when an Israeli soldier is killed by Egyptians coming over the border, where's the outrage there? Where is the outrage when President Obama turns around and says, the 67 lines, we should rethink those? So for me, it's more personal to say Israel has given up 77% of the land in the original Palestinian mandate. 77% has been given up by Israel. So when is enough enough? And I think that's why 77% has been given up. You have a nuclear trending Iran next to it. So you see the shrinking of the state. You see the security of the Jewish people at risk. We need to work very closely with Netanyahu to together define what a red line is to make sure that this does not happen.
You at the moment would say you don't have a specific way of defining it for yourself, do you?
In terms of where that red line is?
Yes.
What I've learned about being in the military, when you're on the front lines, you have intelligence. You know what's going on, right? Now that we are in the bleachers, I'm not going to kid people and say, I have perfect information. So I don't necessarily know based on number of centrifuges, number of uranium that's been enriched. We know what they've been planning, what they've said about long-range missile delivery. In terms of how those pieces come together and where they are, and then diplomatically where the line is, I would need to have experts kind of lay that out for us right now, because I'm a pragmatist. On most of these topics we'll talk about. I'm a pragmatist. I listen, I learn. And I think I'd have to work with the Israelis to basically say, where is that red line? And what is clear enough to the Atomic Energy Agency also, too, who's in there verifying, to get their input to say, here's where the red line is. There's one person from Connecticut who does have nuclear experience. I know that it's best to say, let the experts define, and then I can reinforce where that line is.
Is it your instinct that either Israel or the United States has the ability to in some way take out Iran's nuclear program?
I'd say yes.
Do you think the American people have the will to send, first of all, you talked about boots on the ground. I've heard some people say to me, this could be handled from the air.
Right.
It's hard for me to believe that's true, but what do I know? But I do wonder whether the American people, who are so weary of war, Steve,
and so am I,
would be willing to, in fact, engage in another war with Iran, and whether it would be politically realistic for either a President Obama or a President Romney to authorize military action from the air or with boots on the ground against Iran. Do you have any instinct as to whether it is politically viable for the incoming administration, whichever it is, to literally take military action against Iran in terms of the American people's sentiments?
I think the answer to that is yes, but I think the case has to be made. And as Americans, we've been shown when there's transparency, and a lot of times, and we've seen this with many different administrations, Republican and Democrat, when you make the case correctly, right, and you appeal to the American people why this is in our national interest, and that is an honest appeal with transparency and as much information as you can provide, the American people support. But the American people also don't like when they find out they're in a situation that could have been avoided. We saw that with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we're starting to see fingerprints of that now in Libya. Okay? And we're also seeing that in Afghanistan, where in Afghanistan here, we basically are sitting with an environment where we just doubled the number of kids from Connecticut, men and women and kids, from the Connecticut National Guard in Afghanistan. We went from 250 to 550 just a few weeks ago. And I sit back there as a Navy veteran saying, what's the mission? Explain to the American people what the mission is. We know 2014 is some arbitrary time, but if there is no mission, we should bring our kids home now. If there is a mission, explain it to us. Because, Mark, the hardest thing that I ever did in my life, bar none, was having to deliver a casket draped with an American flag to a mother. And when you deliver that flag to a mother, it does nothing to your heart and mind like I've never had transformed. The only thing that would have made that moment worse would have been if I didn't know the mission. So right now we have 550 kids in Afghanistan. We don't know what the mission is. I wouldn't want to be the one having to deliver that flag to a mother. So when you then pull it back to Iran and our role there, the case has to be built up. There has to be transparency and openness of everything we tried along the way, getting up to the point of then why our involvement and what will our involvement be and over what period of time. And I think we see what's happening with nation-building efforts, which generally I don't think have planned out the way we tend to think they do in a nice, easy, simple fashion. So I do believe that the case can be made to the American people. I do believe the American people are resilient. I think the American people overall understand the value of our interests and Israel's interests and our role in the Middle East.
Do you have a sense at all of what Governor Romney's position is on Iran? Does it matter in terms of your own election? Is it any different, Steve, than I hear coming out of the White House today? At the moment, is there basically bipartisan attitudes towards Iran, or can you hear or identify for us a difference of philosophy between the way the current administration and a Romney administration would approach the Iran problem?
I don't know if I've seen too many different. I think both of them have basically said diplomacy, sanctions, work towards a point we cannot allow Israel to have a nuclear weapon.
Iran.
I'm sorry, Iran. For some reason I keep,
right.
But I think between them, I think they've been fairly consistent on that level.
Too.
And now, will one be in the end work more aggressively with the Israelis? Just from what I've seen and the words, I think Governor Romney seems to be more aligned in terms of even what he said about Jerusalem, in terms of that being the capital of Israel. So I at least his words tend to be more of, we're going to work in partnership, and I think that may give a better working relationship to what you may have to eventually work together on Iran.
Okay. Do you think if you're elected and Governor Romney is elected president, would you have any trouble opposing a position taken by a Republican president?
Not at all. And I'd have no problem taking a position if I thought it was the right thing that Barack Obama said was on a certain policy. I mean, I've been in a Christian, Jewish marriage for 15 years, so I've had to agree and disagree with my spouse.
You've also been a naval officer. Isn't it your responsibility to take orders from the commander-in-chief?
As long as they're lawful. Yes, as long as they're lawful.
But it's not. I don't know that always the issue is whether it's lawful or not. I understand the distinction, but there can be times when it's a policy. There's nothing illegal about the policy, but it's a policy which, if you were talking to Suzanne in your kitchen, you would say, "I'm not comfortable with this." Now the question is, what does a Steve Obsitnik do when he goes public and when Fox or MSNBC sticks a microphone in your face and asks you to comment on a policy? The legality is not the issue, but maybe you don't feel comfortable with it in the privacy of your home.
No, I'm a pragmatic fix-it person, right? And I'm going to Washington to fight for the people of this district for, as I told you, 8 years, 4 terms. And part of that is I want to be beholden to you and your viewers. I don't want to be beholden by a party leadership or a president. And being a career politician, I'm a career leader, okay? And for me to be a career leader and keep my independence, which is what this district has been around for 40 or 43 years, it's been a right-of-center, been held by a right-of-center Republican who has voted Crochet 66% of his time, not 95% of the time like Jim Himes has. It's that level of independence which I believe very strongly in, and why I've said I have to maintain that through my own term limits, so that for the next 8 years I can have clarity of mind and thought that I'm doing the right thing for the people of this district.
You should explain to people why you're using the phrase 8 years.
Oh, 8 years. So for me, I think that the large bodies of work can be done in Congress within about 8 to 10 years. Okay, 6 years is too short. 10 years starts to get too long. I still got to make some money in the private sector for myself. I got kids to send to college. But also I don't want to go there and have Washington change me and my relationship with my wife and my kids. So I want to serve. I go to the U.S. House of Representatives for 8 years, and then I come home and I create another job.
That's your plan?
That's my plan.
Okay. This election is not only about a Barack Obama and a Mitt Romney, but it is the way has evolved. There are 2 visions for what government is and how government serves. The single greatest criticism I hear from within the Jewish community of a Mitt Romney, it has to do with the 47% comment. And it's not the number that I hear being questioned. It's what he said afterward, that he seemed to feel that people who expect or feel entitled to health care, housing, and food, it was as if Americans are not entitled to that. The philosophy of government, it seems to me, to be sort of brought to the fore with that question. To what extent does government have a responsibility to provide to an American citizen, by virtue of his being an American citizen, food, clothing, and a degree of health care that protects his health, as opposed to saying those things should be done in some way through the private sector, and government's role is not to provide that as an entitlement to individuals. So in general, I'd love to hear your own personal philosophy.
2 points on that. On the first one, there are a group of people in this country that will always need our support and our help. And from a Judeo-Christian value perspective, we need to take care of those that are less fortunate. Okay? I don't think, though, a government exists to take care of everyone's food, clothing, and shelter. And if you go back to my family growing up in Czechoslovakia, right, and what I saw when government played too large a role versus what I've seen the role of government here in enabling my grandfather on my mother's side to be an entrepreneur and grow his business, and the self-confidence that that's brought, to me, that's the answer. The answer is in jobs. And I was in Homes with Hope in Westport the other day. Sat down about 15 people who had lost their homes, applying for disability, living in a shelter. Of the 15 people, 12 said, help me get a job. I want my self-esteem. I want to provide for myself. And there's something inside of us. There are a group of people that absolutely need help. But for most of us, we need to create an environment where we can go out, chart our own passion, our own destiny, fight for a better life for ourselves than what the government can provide as a backstop. And that served my whole family since 1928 in this country very well, and I think that will serve many other countries, many other families too. The other thing I just want to touch on real quickly between Republican and Democrat, which I didn't understand about both parties, is that the Republican Party says we want a small government fiscally and a big government socially. And the Democratic Party says, I want a big government fiscally and a small government socially. Now, I'm an engineer, okay? My wife, Suzanne, says I can be linear sometimes. But if I say a small, focused government, I take those two pieces and say a small focused government on fiscal and social issues. And I think the more we can do that, the more we allow people fiscally to preserve our quality of life, our national security, balance our budgets, and on the social issues like things on a woman's right to choose, I believe that a woman should have the right to choose, and government should be limited and focused on those topics as well. That just makes sense to me. So it really is getting government to play that right level in our lives, but understanding that people do need help underneath that. And I'm a compassionate person for sure.
Steve, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I'm hoping that if you're elected, you will make yourself as available to me after you're in Congress as you have before. I would love to continue the conversation. I said this to your opponent. I'm going to say it to you. I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
And again, I'm just hoping that we retain an ability to talk to each other. It's been a real joy for me.
It's been a joy. We have too many relationships between us, so that will absolutely happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Steve.
I appreciate it, Rabbi. Thank you.
Steve Obsitnik, who is the Republican candidate in the 4th District of Connecticut. And of course, as always, if you have any thoughts or comments to some of the ideas that Steve has articulated here, please, we'd love to hear from you. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. And if you want to be in touch with Steve Obsitnik yourself, you can do so by emailing me, and I will forward your emails on to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.